Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another amazing Soldiers Memorial Chow and Chat. My name is Marvin Alonzo Greer, and I am the Education and Visitor Experience Lead at Soldiers Memorial Military Museum, which is a part of the Missouri Historical Society. First, we'd like to give a brief shout out to one of our local veterans here in St. Louis, Captain Ethel Merriam, who yesterday celebrated her 97th birthday. She served during World War II. She enlisted in 1943 as a WAVE. Those were the women who served in the U.S. Navy. And after a brief stint in the Navy, she came back and retired, and then went back in the Navy, and then finally retired in 1983. So we want to give a shout out to Captain Ethel Merriam for her 97th birthday. Today's program is brought to you by Beelman Truck Company. They're our sponsor for our Soldiers Memorial and Chow and Chats, and we are greatly appreciative to have Beelman be our sponsors. It's through sponsorships like this that allow the Chow and Chats to take place. Our Chow and Chat series, this Chow and Chat series is extra special today because of the historical significance of the 15th Amendment. Today marks the anniversary of, well, this week marks the anniversary of Juneteenth. Juneteenth is the celebration in Galveston, Texas, where African Americans in Texas received the news in 1865 that they were free. This was part of the Reconstruction era, which our presenter today will speak about. The historical significance of the 15th Amendment is extra important today, granted with all the things that are going on in our society surrounding police brutality, Black Lives Matter, and the state of affairs in the United States. So we thought it would be a great time to invite Nick Sako, our expert at the U.S. Grant National Historic Site, a friend of mine and one of the best interpreters that I've ever actually had the privilege of working with, as well as hearing present. So without further ado, well, before I get to, sorry, I'm rushing ahead of myself, Nick, I'm getting kind of excited with your program. At the end of the program, there will be time for questions and answers. For those of you who have questions during the program, we invite you to use the question and answer box. You will see that at the bottom of your screen, a box that says Q&A. If you click that, you can type in your questions. All participants will be muted, and so they will be unable, we will be unable to hear your questions verbally, but you can submit your questions throughout the program, and we will answer those at the end of the program. We also have closed captioning available, so you will also note at the bottom of your screen a closed captioning box. And if you click that box, closed captioning will pop up for your access. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Nick Sako from the U.S. Grant National Historic Site. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Marvin. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today and talk about Ulysses S. Grant and the 15th Amendment. Shortly here, we should have some PowerPoint slides loading up, and I'll be kind of going back and forth with the PowerPoint slides and using those to help talk about the presentation here. But I think it's really important to look at Grant and his presidency. Many of you may have seen the recent History Channel documentary on Ulysses S. Grant, and there were some good things about the documentary, but I think a lot of us at the park were somewhat disappointed in the lack of attention given to the Reconstruction era and the amount of time that it was given in the overall documentary. It was only about 30 minutes that really focused on Grant's presidency and Reconstruction. So I'm hoping with today's presentation to kind of provide a larger context to explain Grant's own evolution when it comes to things like slavery and race and voting rights, and kind of highlighting not just his presidency, but what he was thinking here in St. Louis as well, to provide a larger contextual understanding of Grant's time. Grant's time as president of the United States and how he came to become such a vocal advocate for the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution. So hopefully we'll get the slides going here shortly, Marvin.
It's showing on my screen that they are up and running.
Okay.
Let me stop sharing real quick and see.
Sure.
What it is. Did that work?
It just says Missouri Historical Society has started screen sharing. It's just a black screen. Would you want me to share? I have the PowerPoints up if you want me to share my screen instead.
That would be very helpful, Nick, if you could.
Okay. Okay, how about that? Can we all see the PowerPoints now?
That's perfect. Thank you, Nick.
Great, fantastic. Okay, so yes, Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site. We are in the suburbs of St. Louis. If you've never visited us before, we are part of the National Park Service. We're about 12 miles southwest of downtown St. Louis. We're a relatively small site, only about 10 acres in size. And our primary purpose at the site is interpreting this big green house that you see on the screen, ironically called Whitehaven. This house was the childhood home of Ulysses S. Grant's wife, Julia. Her family, the Dent family, owned Whitehaven prior to the Civil War, and it was a plantation. The property at the time before the war was 850 acres in size, and there were upwards of 30 enslaved African Americans who lived and worked on the Whitehaven property. So our job at the site is to talk about not just Ulysses S. Grant and his connections to Whitehaven, but also the Dent family and the enslaved African Americans and their experiences. And I like working at this site because we're really not so much a military site as we're a site that's inherently political. We talk about political, social, and cultural history, and we talk about the ways that the Civil War has been remembered over time as well. So we get to talk about the antebellum period and Reconstruction. So in that regard, it's a fairly broad interpretive focus that we give at the site. But that is where I work, and we are 12 miles from downtown St. Louis. Now, to start this presentation, I feel like it's important to kind of highlight a little bit about the history of voting in the United States. Now, our U.S. Constitution, when it was originally established, the framers of the Constitution are very concerned about finding that balance between rights of the federal government and rights of the state governments, promoting this concept of dual sovereignty and what we would call federalism. And depending on your perspective, one could argue that one of the flaws of the original creation of the Constitution is that it sort of punted when it came to the issue of citizenship and voting. Who gets to call themselves a citizen of the United States of America? Who is entitled to the right to vote? Is there a difference between who gets to be a citizen and who gets to be a voter? All of these questions are pretty much avoided in the Constitution and shifted over to the states. So the original Constitution, the word citizenship never appears in the original Constitution, and voting relegated to the states. So for the most part, the various states in determining who gets to be an eligible voter are going to largely base it on property qualifications. And it's important to point out here too, that in this early American period, from the ratification of the Constitution in 1787 until Andrew Jackson's election of the presidency in 1828, that it was mostly white men who have the right to vote, who have the adequate amount of property to be an eligible voter. However, it is important to point out that there are a small number of free African Americans who also are allowed to vote in some states. And actually, as a matter of fact, in New Jersey, the original constitution in New Jersey did not limit the franchise to men. It said that all persons that had an adequate amount of property ownership had the right to vote. So in some cases, we even see women voting in the case of New Jersey. But when it's all said and done during this time, only about 6% of the entire population held the right to vote during these early decades of the founding of the United States. Now, during the Jacksonian era, roughly starting in 1828 and continuing into the antebellum period leading up to the Civil War, we are going to see some fundamental changes to who is entitled to the right to vote. Part of this is the early beginnings of industrialization. We see more people, more men entering into the workforce, earning wages, and demanding more rights as laborers. We're also seeing the rise of mass political participation. Andrew Jackson, sort of his fundamental belief, he wants to end monopoly government by the elites. He wants to bring government to the common man. He calls for the equal protection of the law for white Americans. And he has this strong aversion to aristocracy and a strong support for majority rule. So kind of building off this Jacksonian spirit, almost every state in the Union is going to change their voter eligibility requirements and remove these property qualifications. So by the time of the Civil War, upwards of 90% of white men around the country have the right to vote and participate in elections thanks to these changes during the Jacksonian era. However, it is very important to point out that these changes come at a cost. Free blacks, for the most part, are going to lose their right to vote during the Jacksonian period. So various states, including Maryland, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina, revised their constitutions and removed stipulations allowing for free blacks to vote. So yes, even in some of the southern slave states, free African Americans had a right to vote leading into the Jacksonian period. In the case of New York, very small number of African American men have the right to vote, but there is a property restriction on that as well. So I would describe this period right now as white men creating what would be called a fraternity of equals, or a Herrenvolk democracy. Herrenvolk is basically slang for master race democracy. So the Jacksonian era, we see this dramatic change where the mass majority of white men have the ability to vote, but we see changes in other ways as well. And we can't leave out the fact too that this also coincides with mass Indian removal, the Trail of Tears, and this desire to conquer new lands in the West so that free white men can move out to the West, become free laborers, and participate in this form of government in the West. So Ulysses S. Grant, this is the context in which he grows up and becomes an active participant in politics. Now, Ulysses S. Grant is not from St. Louis. He was born and raised in Ohio. He went to school at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and he graduated from West Point in 1843. When he graduated, his first assignment was in St. Louis at Jefferson Barracks, which is a military post still around today, about 5 miles south of Whitehaven Park. And while in St. Louis, Ulysses came out to Whitehaven. He met Julia Dent. They fell in love, began the relationship, and Grant even proposed to Julia on the front porch of Whitehaven. So Grant is going to serve in the U.S. Army for about 11 years, but in 1854, continued separation from his wife Julia and his young children motivates Grant to leave the U.S. Army. He offers his resignation, and he makes the decision to come to St. Louis to try his hand at farming at Whitehaven. So for me, this is a fairly interesting decision by Grant. He had grown up in a strongly anti-slavery home in Ohio. He had even gone to a school run by a reverend named John Rankin in northern Kentucky, and Rankin was an active member of the Underground Railroad. So Grant had had experience kind of listening to anti-slavery thought, being exposed to anti-slavery thought. And he even said in his personal memoirs that growing up, his political idol was Henry Clay, and he considered himself a Whig. However, in choosing to move to Whitehaven, Grant is moving on to this plantation, and he is going to be interacting with enslaved African Americans on a daily basis here. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about Grant's relationship with slavery in just a minute. And what's also fascinating here is that Grant is moving to St. Louis in 1854, the same year that slavery's westward expansion is becoming the primary political issue of the day. It's the same year the Kansas-Nebraska Act is passed, essentially allowing new settlers of Kansas and Nebraska territory to determine themselves whether or not they want to allow slavery in these new territories. So Grant, when he's living in St. Louis, he's reading about the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the response to it. He's watching his fellow Missourians making their way, in many cases, illegally into Kansas to try to vote for delegates that are going to allow for Kansas to become a slave state. And as I asserted here, it becomes the primary political issue of the day. Now, Grant himself, while he was an avid reader and followed politics, he was not an active voter for most of his adult life. As a member of the U.S. Army, he elected not to vote in any elections of any sort. That is going to change in 1856, however. This election, again, is going to revolve around slavery's westward expansion. We'll see the rise of the newly established Republican Party. They will nominate General John C. Fremont, who campaigns on the idea of ending slavery's expansion into new Western territories like Kansas and Nebraska. James Buchanan will run as the Democrat on the concept of popular sovereignty and allowing the settlers of these new territories to determine slavery's fate for themselves. And then former President Millard Fillmore campaigning on nativism, anti-immigrant platform. In St. Louis, the real conflict was between Buchanan and Fillmore. There really was no Republican Party base in St. Louis or really all of Missouri. But if Grant was strongly anti-slavery, he did have the opportunity as a civilian in 1856 to vote for Fremont. Well, when the election rolled around, Grant voted for Buchanan. So Grant recalled in his memoirs that he believed that James Buchanan was going to be the best candidate to ensure national unity moving forward. And he admits in his memoirs he was actually very skeptical about the Republican Party and their platform. So this political cartoon is actually from the Reconstruction era when Grant was president, and is trying to highlight the fact that Grant had voted for the Democrat candidate Buchanan. You can see in the top right corner a sign that says "Vote for Buchanan, the extension of slavery." It also depicts Grant as this hardscrabble farmer in St. Louis. But what's notable is if you look back there, he's got a cart of firewood, but there's an enslaved African American that is sitting on that cart of wood. So again, it's trying to make this connection that Grant had this very intimate relationship with slavery and had voted for Buchanan in St. Louis. So Grant did end up owning an enslaved man named William Jones for part of the time that he lived in St. Louis. He acquired Jones from his father-in-law, Frederick Dent. Grant also hired out enslaved African Americans from other enslavers in the St. Louis area. We know from numerous letters that Grant wrote that he would basically pay money to these other slaveholders and utilize those enslaved African Americans on the Whitehaven property so that Grant could raise fruits, vegetables, and grains. Grant also built a log cabin called Hardscrabble that's still around today that most likely would have been built with the aid of enslaved labor as well. And then finally, there was a letter that we have from 1860 in which Grant criticizes the Republican Party and wishes to see the Republicans lose both in the presidential elections and in the elections here in St. Louis in 1860 as well. I highlight all of this to point out that the Ulysses S. Grant of 1860 is not necessarily a forward-thinking, anti-slavery person who would even consider the idea of African-American men or non-white people having the right to vote. He had grown up in this era of Herrenvolk master race democracy, and he has this intimate relationship with slavery while living in St. Louis right up to the Civil War. Now, when the Civil War breaks out, Grant believes that it's going to be a short war, and in his mind, it's going to be best, in his words, to quote, preserve all constitutional rights. He admits in his memoirs that had he been able to vote in 1860, the Grants had moved to a town called Galena in the state of Illinois, and Grant had not lived in Illinois long enough to vote in the 1860 election, but had he voted, he would have voted for Stephen Douglas, the popular sovereignty candidate, and not Abraham Lincoln. In Grant's mind, he is originally opposed to emancipation when the war breaks out because in his mind, it's going to be a short war, and he does not want the federal government to essentially burn its bridges any further with white Southerners. He wants to bring white Southerners back into the fold, and he doesn't want to give this impression that this constitutional right to own slaves is going to be violated through this war. So Grant writes several letters to his wife, Julia, his father-in-law, Frederick Dent, and his father, essentially asserting this very line of thinking, very in line with the conservative Northern Democrat at the beginning of the war. I also think it's important to highlight that when it came to runaway enslaved people trying to find refuge with the U.S. Army, that originally Grant followed in line with what his superiors and commanders ordered. There was an order called General Order Number 3, and it was issued by Grant's superior, Henry Halleck, at the beginning of the war. And essentially, as runaway enslaved people are making their way to the U.S. Army for refuge, General Orders Number 3 orders the Army to not allow these enslaved people to have refuge with the U.S. Army. So at the beginning of the war, Grant is playing a role in pushing enslaved people back into the hands of their enslavers at the beginning of the war. Now, it is very important to highlight, however, that Grant is going to begin to evolve in his thinking at this time. And I would argue that one of the major turning points in Grant's thinking is the Battle of Shiloh. The Battle of Shiloh is fought in April of 1862. At that point, it's the bloodiest battle of the Civil War, 25,000 casualties, more than all previous U.S. wars combined in a matter of 2 days. And Grant admits in his memoirs that essentially at this point, he realizes that the Confederacy is not going to give up their fight. He realizes that there are more white Southerners than he realized that are supporting the Confederate effort, and that they've reached the point of no return. He also realizes by this time as well that the Confederacy is using enslaved African Americans to benefit their war effort as well. They're basically impressing enslaved people from slaveholders, and they're using enslaved African Americans to dig earthworks, to work in the camp, to help with providing supplies, to allow the white men to fight on the front against the U.S. Army. So Grant is starting to realize that perhaps there is a benefit to thinking about emancipation and thinking about the end of slavery as a war measure to help speed the end of this war against the Confederacy. When Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, Grant supports the proclamation. He writes a letter to Lincoln later on in the summer of 1863, vocally supporting the idea of Black men joining the U.S. Army and United States Colored Troop regiments. Grant is also going to work to establish refugee camps. So General Orders Number 3, with the coming of the Emancipation Proclamation, that's pretty much thrown out the door. During the Vicksburg campaign in the summer of 1863, Grant is going to work with Chaplain John Eaton, who was working for the U.S. Army, and Grant and Eaton are going to establish a huge refugee camp in the Vicksburg area during the campaign. Historian Brooks Simpson, in his book, Let Us Have Peace, talks about the fact that for many of these African Americans, they're essentially, they're coming into these camps, the children are receiving education, the adults are working for wages with the U.S. Army. So Grant in a way, is establishing a social safety net for enslaved African Americans who have now been declared free through the Emancipation Proclamation. Equally important, Grant and the Lincoln administration are going to end prisoner of war exchanges after the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. Under Confederate law, Black soldiers were considered enslaved. They were considered property under Confederate law. And so essentially, if Black soldiers were captured by the Confederacy, they were going to be either sold back into slavery or outright killed and executed by Confederate forces. Grant sees this as an outrage. In his mind, Black and white troops should be treated the same. And if Black troops are going to be executed and sold back into slavery, he believes this is wrong. So he is going to end prisoner of war exchanges because of these mistreatments of Black soldiers. And to be sure, there were white Northerners who opposed this effort. They opposed this move. They wanted to see prisoner of war exchanges continuing. They did not want to hear stories of Union soldiers dying of hunger in Andersonville, loved ones dying in Andersonville. But in Grant's mind, this is a matter of principle, ensuring that Black troops are treated the same way as white troops in the United States Army. So we can definitely see the wheels turning, and we're starting to see an evolution in Grant's thinking when it comes to these larger questions of race and the status of African Americans in United States society. All right, now, and I want to add too very quickly that at the end of the Civil War in 1865, Grant did issue a general order congratulating his soldiers and boldly asserting that the war had been caused by slavery. So he did come around to understand that the cause, context, and consequences of the Civil War were bound up in the institution of slavery. Now, during the beginning part of Reconstruction, Andrew Johnson is going to succeed Abraham Lincoln as president of the United States after Lincoln's assassination, and Grant is going to continue serving as general of the armies in charge of the entire U.S. Army. And while Grant is going to try his best to avoid politics, the reality of the situation is that the process of Reconstruction and bringing the country back together again is inherently political. So as a brief summarization of what's going on at the beginning part of Reconstruction, Andrew Johnson believes that the policies being established for Reconstruction go through him alone, that is through executive control. And in his mind, Johnson is simply following in the footsteps of President Lincoln, who likewise asserted that he alone was the one to control policy for Reconstruction. Johnson supports pardon and amnesty for most Confederates, even though he originally talks about making treason odious and hanging the high leaders of the Confederacy. Vast majority of Confederates will receive pardon and amnesty, and a large number of the more wealthy and elite Confederate leaders go to Washington, D.C. Sorry about that. They go to Washington, D.C. and basically bend the knee to Johnson and take a loyalty oath that makes Johnson happy, and they will receive pardon and amnesty and the restoration of their citizenship rights. So Johnson wants that quick Reconstruction, and he is vehemently opposed to civil rights. So when it comes to the rights of African Americans, Johnson acknowledges that slavery has come to an end, but other than that, he doesn't believe the federal government should be guaranteeing any other civil or political rights for African Americans. The Congress, particularly the radical Republican wing of the Republican Party, has a much different perspective. They believe that Congress should be able to establish legislation and have control of Reconstruction policy. They want harsh penalties for Confederate leaders. They want a slow Reconstruction that might take several years to take place to bring back the former Confederate states into the Union. And they believe that the expansion of civil rights for African Americans is fundamental to successful Reconstruction policy and a successful political reunion of North and South. So it's a fundamentally different perspective than the Johnson administration. Now, we're going to see some civil rights legislation established by Congress during this kind of 3-year period between 1866 and 1868. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 is the country's first civil rights legislation. Now, political leaders in the 19th century, they distinguished between civil rights and political rights. So civil rights largely referred around rights that were protected by government. So having the right to file a lawsuit or to be sued, to own property, to sign contracts. So these are the sort of things that are going to be protected through the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And is largely in response to both Andrew Johnson's rhetoric and policies and the establishment of what were called black codes in the former Confederate states that essentially try to reinstate slavery by another name in the former Confederate states. So the Civil Rights Act establishes sort of civil equality between white and black. The Military Reconstruction Act of 1867 also played along these lines by establishing 5 military districts in the South and also requiring that these Southern governments write new constitutions that allow for black men to have the right to vote. So prior to the 15th Amendment, we're actually going to see African-American men in the former Confederacy gaining the right to vote through the Military Reconstruction Act of 1867. Equally important, the U.S. Congress is going to mandate black male voting in federal territories. So in Washington, D.C., Congress will pass legislation allowing for black male voting. And as new Western territories apply to become part of the Union, a new stipulation for admittance into the Union is going to be new constitutions that allow for black men to vote. Finally, we'll see the 14th Amendment, which is an extension of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. It establishes the concept of birthright citizenship. If you're born in the United States, you are automatically a citizen of the country. It also establishes the concept of equal protection of the laws. No longer can we pass legislation that affects one racial group or whatever differently than another racial group. So the 14th Amendment is hugely important here for establishing the concept of civil rights and equal protection of the laws, with an important caveat that Native American Indians who retain their tribal alliance are still not considered citizens of the United States, despite this legislation, an important footnote to add to the story here. Okay, very briefly, the Military Reconstruction Act of 1867, again, really important in establishing black voting rights in the South. The 5 districts consisted of Virginia being its own district, the Carolinas being a 2nd district, Alabama, Georgia, Florida being a 3rd district, Arkansas and Mississippi is the 4th, and Texas and Louisiana as the 5th military district. Tennessee was exempt from the Military Reconstruction Act because they ratified the 14th Amendment. So they were kind of left off the hook in this regard as well. Okay, now, the 14th Amendment, as I've alluded to, it establishes civil rights and equal protection of the laws and national citizenship, but it did not guarantee any additional voting rights. And as a matter of fact, Section 2 of the 14th Amendment provides leeway for Southern states to continue, and Northern states to continue disenfranchising their black population. And I would argue that the rise of the 15th Amendment, allowing for black men to vote, is going to be in part because of Northern resistance to black voting rights. So in the Deep South, we see that Military Reconstruction Act, but the Congress is going to try to basically leave the question of Northern voting to the Northern states themselves. The federal government, again, in line with this idea of federalism, federal government does not want to dictate to the Northern states who should be an eligible voter. That's the thinking originally. The Republican Party doesn't want to wade into this. They don't want to necessarily have to come out and give black men the right to vote. Between 1865 and 1867, every Northern state that had a referendum on black voting rejected it. In 1868, Minnesota on the 3rd try and the state of Iowa did allow for black voting, but for the most part, these state referendums were largely a failure. So in late 1868, going into early 1869, the Republican Party in Congress decides that, well, we really should be pushing for Black voting rights. And the argument for this is going to be both on ideological and political grounds. There is naked self-interest involved with this as well. So on ideological grounds, what we're going to see is an explicit connection between military service in the Civil War and added citizenship rights and voting rights in Reconstruction. A perfect example of an ideological argument is actually from James Garfield, future president. At this time, he is a congressman out of Ohio. And he made a very powerful speech in 1865 about Black male voting. And this is, I'm going to quote just a part of this speech from 1865. He said, quote, "In the extremity of our distress, we called upon the Black man to help us save the Republic. And amid the very thunders of battle, we made a covenant with him, sealed both with his blood and ours. When the nation was redeemed, God declared that the Black man should be free and share with us in its glories and blessings. Have we done it? Have we given freedom to the Black man? What is freedom? Is it the bare privilege of not being chained, of not being bought and sold, branded and scourged? If this is all, then freedom is a bitter mockery." So Garfield is saying that just simply having your freedom to not be bought, sold, and branded is not true freedom. There has to be more meat on the bone, so to speak. And Garfield will make this strong argument in support of Black male voting. And of course, there's a sort of a self-interest motive here too, because more Republicans are starting to realize that their best friends and the most loyal Unionists in the South are Black Southerners. And in order to build the Republican Party and to get a base in the Deep South, one way to do this is to provide for Black Southerners and Black males throughout the country to be able to have voting rights. Congress debates passing a law versus passing a constitutional amendment. And the idea eventually becomes a constitutional amendment because it'll ultimately have stronger power. A future Congress, a future president could push for a law to be overturned. And a Voting Rights Act of 1868 could have been overturned by a future Democrat Congress. So Republicans decide to go through the amendment process instead. And of course, there's a question about whether or not there should be a universal right to vote. And I'm going to go back to that in just a minute. So let's go back to Ulysses S. Grant. Grant originally was opposed to Black male voting rights. He admitted in his memoirs that, quote, "I would have preferred a time of probation in which the ex-slaves could prepare themselves for the privileges of citizenship before the full right would be conferred." However, Grant finds himself moving closer to the Republican Party. Numerous disagreements with President Andrew Johnson really isolate Grant. During Johnson's impeachment in 1868, Grant actually wrote numerous letters saying that he thought Johnson's impeachment would bring peace to the country. And he's very concerned about Johnson's meddling in the military districts in the Deep South. There are military commanders in each of those 5 districts we mentioned earlier. And in Grant's mind, Johnson is essentially removing people like Philip Sheridan, who were actively working to protect Black rights, and putting in people like Winfield Scott Hancock, who's a conservative Democrat, who is basically turning a blind eye to Ku Klux Klan violence and white supremacist terrorism in the Deep South. So Grant himself is moving towards the Republican Party. And as I alluded to earlier, Grant believes that Black Southerners are the most loyal to the Union. And in order to get peace and harmony and national reunification, increased rights, equal rights between white and Black are necessary to ensure national union moving forward. So when Grant is elected president in 1868, and when he gives his first inaugural address in 1869, Grant announces in his inaugural that he wants to see the 15th Amendment ratified. In 1870, in March of 1870, the 15th Amendment is formally ratified. It's a fairly short amendment. It says the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And for Grant, this is a pivotal moment in United States history. Grant took the uncharacteristic move of writing a special message to Congress in March of 1870 upon ratification of the 15th Amendment. And this is what Grant said about the 15th Amendment. He said, quote, "A measure which makes at once 4 million people voters who were previously declared by the highest tribunal in the land not citizens of the United States," he's referring to the Dred Scott case, "is indeed a measure of grander importance than any other one act of the kind from the foundation of our free government to the present day. I repeat that the adoption of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution completes the greatest civil change and constitutes the most important event that has occurred since the nation came into life." So for Grant, the most important event in the country's history was not the Battle of Gettysburg. It was not the Emancipation Proclamation. It was not Lincoln's assassination. It was the ratification of the 15th Amendment and this powerful statement on the meaning of the Civil War. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and just to review, 13th Amendment ends slavery, 14th Amendment, that national citizenship, equal protection of the laws. These three constitutional amendments are a statement on the results of the American Civil War and what the Civil War was fought over. Finally, to conclude, even though Grant had lofty rhetoric about the 15th Amendment, and on paper it looked like it was going to work, there were numerous shortcomings of the 15th Amendment, and in the end, it'll be basically disowned, ignored, as we see the rise of Jim Crow. Importantly, the 15th Amendment did not guarantee a universal right to vote. The wording of the amendment is essentially in negative terms. You can't keep somebody from voting because of the race, color, or previous enslavement, but there are legal loopholes in this. It still allows for things like poll taxes, literacy tests, any sort of other poll taxes. So there's all different sorts of legal loopholes that the former Confederate South can use to disenfranchise African Americans, and essentially doing it without saying that it's race-based. So there are legal loopholes at play. The 15th Amendment is also poorly enforced as well. Going back to section 2 of the 14th Amendment that I mentioned earlier, section 2 of the 14th Amendment allowed for Congress to diminish representation of any state that kept Black Americans from voting. That provision of the Constitution has never been enforced. So essentially, the 15th Amendment is thrown out with the rise of Jim Crow. The South gets added protection or added representation in Congress, but then essentially throwing out the Black votes with the rise of Jim Crow and these various various mechanisms that were used to prevent African Americans from voting. So the 15th Amendment is a part of a larger story about civil rights and political rights during the Reconstruction era. And as the famous scholar W.E.B. Du Bois mentioned, he talks about Reconstruction being a brief moment under the sun, eventually overturned by Jim Crow. But we do see this period during Grant's presidency where African American men are voting in mass. In 1868, Grant's victory in the popular vote is due in part to 500,000 African American men who voted for him and allowed him to win the popular vote. And we see other efforts through the Grant administration to fight white supremacist terrorism through the establishment of the Department of Justice and various enforcement acts to fight terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. So that's about all I have for my presentation. Would love to open it up for conversation and any questions you might have. Thank you.
Awesome job. Thank you, Nick, for that that amazing presentation on the 15th Amendment, on Grant's role, and helping us better understand the role of 15th Amendment and the role of Grant when it comes to not just his military record, but the social history. As we discussed prior, sometimes it's not all about the who shot John behind the tree and the battle strategies, but really what does the Civil War mean? Well, it means nothing unless you understand the outcomes of the Civil War, which are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments,
Right.
and then Reconstruction, and later on Jim Crow, and the legacy that leaves on our country today in the 21st century.
Absolutely.
So as we wait for questions to come in, again, if you have questions, please go down to the bottom of your screen and you'll see a question and answer box. If you click that box, you can type in a question, and Nick can answer those for you. And while we wait for those questions to come in, a quick question. I take it you saw the U.S. Grant documentary or mini kind of docu-series that came out by the History Channel, and they covered a little bit of what you spoke about. What do you think some of the stronger points of that docu-series were when it comes to the 15th Amendment and Grant's legacy?
Well, I thought it did do a nice job of sort of showing the evolution in U.S. law, the establishment of the Department of Justice, and Grant's efforts to fight the Ku Klux Klan. I thought it did a pretty good job of summarizing those things. But hopefully I've demonstrated here that Ron Chernow did mess up. He stated that the 15th Amendment allowed for mass numbers of black men to vote. And the reality is that black men were already voting by the 15th Amendment in the South through the Military Reconstruction Act. But the 15th Amendment essentially ensures that black men around the rest of the country, and specifically those northern states that had not approved black voting through state referendums, had the chance to vote. So the chronology got kind of messed up a little bit, but I do appreciate the fact that they highlighted this increased presence of the federal government to try to enforce civil rights, this concept that hadn't even existed before the Civil War.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Here's a great question that came in. Once he was out of office, so as we know today, presidents tend to stay kind of quiet after they leave office and try not to interfere with the next presidential administration. This question says, once he was out of office, did Grant continue to speak out or write about the ongoing affairs or treatment of African Americans and newly freed individuals?
Sure. I'll point to two different things. One is that Ulysses and Julia went on a world tour from 1877 to 79. So basically right after the presidency, the Grants go on this fancy 2-year vacation. And during so in 1877, we see the rise of the sort of this general strike around the country, these huge protests and strikes along the railroads in 1877. And the Rutherford B. Hayes administration mobilized the U.S. military to shut down the protests and to end the strikes on the railroads. And Grant from abroad actually writes a letter to a good friend of his. And he points out that he thought it was odd that the government was so anxious to use the military to shut down these strikes, but at the same time, they weren't using that power to stop terrorism in the South against Black Americans. So he sort of highlighted the hypocrisy of the U.S. government sort of picking and choosing when they wanted to mobilize the U.S. military to reestablish law and order. A second thing I would point to is during that world tour, there was a 2-volume book published by a journalist named John Russell Young. And Young accompanied the Grants, and he wrote a book about the Grants' travels. And Grant spoke extensively about Reconstruction during the world tour. So whereas Grant's memoirs don't talk about Reconstruction at all, Grant actually does discuss Reconstruction in his in the Around the World with General Grant. So for example, he described Reconstruction as, quote, as to whether the control of the government should be thrown immediately into the hands of those who had so recently and persistently tried to destroy the country, or whether the victors should continue to have an equal voice with them in this control. And he goes on to criticize Andrew Johnson. And he actually expressed a little bit of reservation about the 15th Amendment, because he, in retrospect, said that maybe it would have been better just to completely disenfranchise the entire South, white and Black, and put the South under military rule, rather than trying to restore everybody's voting rights and to give Black men voting rights after the war. Because he argued that what the white South ended up doing is they got enhanced representation in Congress and then basically used that representation to push Black men out of the electoral process.
Interesting. So thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
There was a thank you and a question. So the thank you is thank you for for highlighting Grant, and they loved to hear that how he changed and evolved over time from someone who kind of believed in the status quo and this idea that only white men should have the right to vote, to someone who believed in the franchise for at least African Americans and some people of color. And the question is, what was life like for the Grants after his presidency?
So the Grants did that 2-year world tour, and thank you for the nice comments there. They did the 2-year world tour, and then Ulysses and Julia ended up settling in New York City. There'd always been some loose talk of the Grants maybe retiring back to St. Louis, back to the Whitehaven estate. But ultimately, the Grants had 4 children, and 3 of them were living in New York City. So Ulysses and Julia settled out there, and Grant is going to get involved in a Wall Street market swindle, unfortunately. He's going to lose his entire fortune, and then he's going to be diagnosed with inoperable throat cancer. Grant was a very heavy smoker, and starting with the Civil War, for the rest of his life, he was known to smoke up to 20 cigars a day. So Grant will get throat cancer, and he writes his personal memoirs kind of in this race against time, trying to finish the memoirs before he dies of throat cancer in 1885. So it's a real quick summarization of what Ulysses and Julia did after the presidency. Julia went on to live another 17 years, primarily New York City and Washington, D.C. So that's kind of real quick summarization of what they did.
Thank you for that. So when we talk about civil rights, oftentimes people talk about the 1950s and 60s, and both John F. Kennedy and President Lyndon Johnson, really, especially President Lyndon Johnson, being champions of civil rights. It's an interesting comparison that people can compare JFK to being this champion of civil rights. However, it's usually Johnson who really pushed things through.
Right.
And is often overlooked by history because of the Vietnam War and by other aspects of his administration. Can you talk a little bit about that comparison, about civil rights under in the civil rights movement that we think about today, and civil rights with that early movement in the 1860s, 100 years prior?
Sure, absolutely. I have a friend in the National Park Service. His name's Emmanuel Dabney. You know Emmanuel, and he describes the sort of the modern civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s as the televised civil rights movement, and I like that, because really Reconstruction is the country's first civil rights movement in some ways. And to that point, I should mention as well that we are going to see the Civil Rights Act of 1875 that Grant will sign into law during his presidency. And this is a pretty significant piece of legislation, because it banned racial discrimination in public accommodations like hotels, transportation, and theater, and also mandated ending racial discrimination and exclusion in jury service as well. So this is a fairly forward-thinking piece of legislation. And a lot of people don't think about racial segregation and discrimination being banned through federal law in the 19th century. But this law was on the books for 8 years. It was poorly enforced, and the Supreme Court basically declared it unconstitutional in 1883 on the grounds that private individuals and private businesses could not be forced to stop racial discrimination. Kind of the same argument that segregationists make in the 1950s and 1960s. Well, my business, I should be able to determine who comes into my business, and that sort of argument. So we see the Civil Rights Act passed in 1875. It's the last piece of federal civil rights legislation until 1957.
Wow. There's another great question about family dynamics. So obviously, Grant married into a pro-slavery family. Julia was a slaveholder, as well as the entire Dent family. How did Mr. Dent, or as he called himself, Colonel Dent, how did he deal with Grant after the during the Civil War and after the Civil War?
Sure, great question. You'd love to be a fly on the wall and hear some of those conversations. Yeah. Well, Colonel Dent, at the beginning of the war, he actually told Grant that he didn't want to see the Union broken up. But he also said that he didn't want any states to be coerced to stay in the Union. So if Mississippi or Alabama wants to go, the federal government should just let them go. So in Grant's mind, his father-in-law is a secessionist. And then later on in the war, around 1862, Colonel Dent actually refused to take a loyalty oath. So as you know, in St. Louis, cities under military rule, they're doing loyalty oaths, and Colonel Dent refused to take a loyalty oath. And I would argue that probably with the coming of emancipation, it made him even more skeptical and negative towards the Union war effort. But with that all being said, the enslaved laborers of Whitehaven, they basically voted for freedom with their feet, and they ran away and left Whitehaven during the war. And then Colonel Dent himself, he ended up moving into the White House with the Grants when Grant was elected president, and he lived the remainder of his years in the White House, passing away in 1873. But yeah, the dining room conversations continued in the White House dining room. And a couple of years ago, I came across a newspaper article where a reporter was having dinner with the Grants and reported that Colonel Dent was talking about how he was an unreconstructed rebel and talking about how great the Democrat Party was. So that dynamic continued in the White House as well.
Interesting. It's and that definitely highlights conversations that families still have today with mixed political feelings.
Yeah.
So I think that's all we have for questions. We did have a thank you for talking about that Reconstruction is the first civil rights. So thank you for that, attendee, for that shout out. But thank you for this again, Nick. Having this awesome conversation with us. Thank you for all those who attended. This conversation is deeply important to us at the Missouri Historical Society and Soldiers Memorial Military Museum, because connecting the past to the present is deeply important to understanding ourselves as Americans and how we can progress forward. Because without an understanding of the American Civil War, without having an understanding of the founding of our country and these pivotal moments, including the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments and the Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and 60s, then we have a better understanding of the society we live in today in the 21st century. So again, I thank you, Nick, and I thank you all for joining us today. Please check us out on Facebook, on Instagram, or on Twitter. You can follow us at MoHistory or the Missouri Historical Society, and look for upcoming events. Our next event, our next Chow and Chat, will be on July 1st, and we will be looking at the history of the 4th of July as it was celebrated through in the Midwest, but primarily here in Missouri. So again, thank you very much, and we will see you all next time.
Thank
Bye.
you.